Imagine the shock on her face when HOA Karen trespassed into my storm shelter, thinking she could get away with it. But what she didn't know? It was rigged to auto-lock with motion sensors, and she triggered the one thing that turned her entire world upside down. The day began like any other, with the familiar hum of my routine guiding me through the morning. The kids were getting ready for school. The scent of coffee brewing filled the air, and everything seemed calm and normal until I stepped outside. As soon as the fresh morning air hit my face, I saw her, HOA Karen. She was standing there by the entrance of my storm shelter just a few feet away from my property line. The thing about Karen was that she wasn't someone who simply followed rules. She reveled in bending and breaking them to suit her needs. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to her tendency to micromanage every little thing in the neighborhood, but this felt different. She wasn't just walking by, she was actively looking at something, inspecting it, as if searching for an opening or weakness. And that something was my storm shelter. Now, let me be clear. This wasn't just a shed or a garden tool storage. My storm shelter was a carefully designed, reinforced safe haven built with safety and security in mind. It was far from the eyes of prying neighbors, hidden behind the larger fence I had erected for privacy. The idea of her being there was unnerving. But what was worse was the fact that she wasn't just passing by. She was standing there with purpose, her eyes scanning the door, the locks, the very structure I had spent a lot of time and money to secure. I wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe she was trying to find a weakness in the system. Maybe she just couldn't stand seeing someone else's property be so carefully protected while hers was a chaotic mess. Her lawn never quite up to par with the HOA's standards. Whatever her reason, it felt wrong. I could sense the familiar. Tension creeping up inside me, that feeling of being watched, of someone crossing the line into a space that was meant to be off-limits. I don't know what it was about that moment, but something inside me shifted. It wasn't just the fact that Karen was standing there, it was the way she was standing there, so comfortable, so sure of herself. She wasn't even hesitating. She was casually leaning on the fence, peering into the shelter like she was inspecting it for something, maybe a flaw, maybe just out of curiosity. Either way, her presence felt invasive. The storm shelter was off limits, not just because of the obvious security measures, but because it was a personal space. It was a place I had designed specifically to keep my family safe in case of an emergency. Whether it was a tornado, a wildfire, or some other disaster, I had created that space to be a haven, a place of peace and security. And here she was, treating it like it was some sort of public project to be scrutinized. Her behavior was not just disrespectful, it was a blatant disregard for boundaries. Over the years, I had dealt with her petty complaints about the color of my mailbox, the height of my grass, and even the way I parked my car. But this was different. The fact that she had her eyes on my storm shelter felt like a violation of everything I had worked for. I had put a lot of effort into making sure my property remained private and secure, and yet here she was, like a little storm cloud moving in, looking for a way to disrupt it. As I stood there, watching her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Karen wasn't the type to just stop at a glance. I knew her well enough to understand that she wouldn't be satisfied with simply admiring from a distance. If she was this focused on the shelter, there had to be something more going on. The more I observed, the more I realized how deliberate her actions were. She wasn't just standing there. She was trying to find a way in, as if she believed the shelter was something she had a right to access, to control. I started thinking about all the previous run-ins we'd had over the years. They were usually trivial matters. Annoying, yes, but nothing that had ever felt this serious. This wasn't a complaint about the neighborhood's aesthetics or some HOA rule I had unknowingly broken. No, this was an invasion of privacy, and I had no intention of letting it slide. At that moment, I felt a sudden rush of frustration. Karen had always found ways to push boundaries, but this time, I was determined not to let her get away with it. There was something about her determination, her arrogance in thinking she could just step onto my property and poke around wherever she pleased. That made me see red. She was too focused, too intent on whatever she was trying to uncover. Couldn't just let her continue like this, walking all over me and my property. The thought of her thinking she had free rein to do whatever she wanted on my land made my blood boil. It wasn't just about the storm shelter anymore. It was about sending a message. Karen needed to understand that there were boundaries that even the HOA couldn't control, and my storm shelter was one of those boundaries. As she took another step closer to the shelter, I knew I had to act fast. I wasn't going to let her cross that line. Whatever her intentions were, she was going to find out that there were consequences to trespassing on my turf. Karen was no stranger to rules. At least she was aware of them when it suited her. The signs clearly stated that the property was private. The security cameras were there for anyone to see, and the reinforced storm shelter doors left no room for interpretation. They were meant to serve as barriers, not just physical ones, but psychological ones as well. After all, it was a bold statement of my intention to keep my family and belongings safe. Yet, Karen, with her relentless need to push limits, seemed to believe that none of this applied to her. I had always kept a close eye on my property, particularly the storm shelter. It wasn't just another outbuilding. It was a critical part of my home's security plan. Over the years, I'd invested in state-of-the-art motion sensors, automated locking systems, and a security camera network designed to keep intruders, especially the likes of Karen, from gaining access. These were not the kinds of systems you'd find in a typical home. They were sophisticated, hidden, and nearly impossible to bypass unless you knew exactly what you were dealing with. On that particular day, as I stepped away to take an important phone call, I didn't think twice about leaving the security systems in place. After all, the only thing Karen would see was a locked door and a camera. It should have been enough to deter her. Everyone knew that it was off limits, everyone except Karen. And in her mind, there was always a way around the rules. She was a habitual boundary pusher, and the thought that she could simply walk away with an easy win against my carefully designed systems must have been too tempting for her. She had probably convinced herself that the worst-case scenario was a bit of a scolding, or worse, an official warning. What she didn't count on was me anticipating her every move and preparing for something like this. She thought she had found the perfect opportunity when I wasn't watching. She believed she could simply outsmart me by slipping past my vigilance, ignoring the very signs that had been placed for her protection. The moment I turned away, she took action. Slowly, carefully, as if she were trying to avoid detection, she made her way closer to the storm shelter. My eyes, however, were never far from her. The motion sensors embedded in the perimeter around the shelter were programmed to pick up even the slightest disturbance. With every step she took, the system registered her presence, feeding that data back into my phone. She probably thought she was being stealthy, moving with the kind of silent determination that often accompanies someone who believes they are smarter than the system they're dealing with. It wasn't until she was almost at the door that the sensors kicked into gear. I could see her hesitation when the automated locking mechanism activated. A soft click echoed in the air as the massive door sealed shut, trapping her inside the shelter. At that moment, the very thing she thought she could evade had trapped her in a system she had underestimated. Karen had crossed the line, and the door was now her prison. The irony was not lost on me. She had come to invade a space I had built to protect my family, and now she found herself at the mercy of that very same security. Her sense of control, which had carried her through so many minor HOA battles, evaporated. The instant she was locked in, she had no idea what she had triggered. To her, it probably felt like a simple error in timing. But to me, it was part of the plan. A plan I had spent years perfecting to ensure that no one could simply walk into my most secure area. What she didn't know was that the sensors surrounding the shelter were not just passive monitors. They were linked to a broader network that allowed me to control access from anywhere. As soon as the lock engaged, I was immediately notified. In that instant, I knew exactly where she was, what she was doing, and most importantly, I knew that I had the upper hand. She had walked into a trap, one of her own making, and there was no immediate way for her to get out. She had underestimated the level of security, thinking that she could simply bypass everything with a few casual steps. What she didn't realize was that the technology I had put in place was far more intricate than she could have ever imagined. This wasn't a simple lock and key system. This was a network of motion-activated sensors, linked cameras, and automated systems designed to keep everyone, including the most persistent intruders, out. Karen had failed to recognize this, and now she was a prisoner in a place she had no business being. Her confidence, that familiar air of entitlement she carried with her, began to crack. Karen was no longer in control. What she hadn't planned for was that every action she took inside that shelter was being recorded. Every second she spent trying to figure out how to escape, every frantic movement was being captured, stored, and transmitted straight to me. She had no idea that the very thing she thought was a simple trespass was now her biggest mistake. Once the lockdown system was triggered, Karen was completely at the mercy of the design I had put in place. The motion sensors embedded around the storm shelter's perimeter weren't just there for show. They were part of an integrated security network that I had spent considerable time and resources perfecting. These sensors were linked to a sophisticated automation system that controlled everything, from locking mechanisms to communication signals. The moment Karen stepped inside, the system recognized her presence and activated. It wasn't just the door that was locked. Everything was sealed tight, from the ventilation system to any exit points, ensuring no easy way out. What Karen didn't know was that the lockdown was a multi-layered process, and she had triggered each step of it the instant she crossed the threshold. The automated systems were designed not just to secure the space from external threats, but to monitor anyone inside. There was no way to reset or override the lockdown without a specific access code, and only one person had that access: me. Once the sensors picked up motion, the shelter's reinforced doors slammed shut, and Karen was trapped. The systems didn't require any physical force to keep her in. The technology did all the work. Inside, she was cut off from the outside world. The shelter wasn't like an ordinary storage unit or garage. It was built for emergencies, capable of withstanding even the harshest conditions. While most people would think of it as just a shelter from storms or natural disasters, I had designed it with an even deeper purpose in mind. It was a controlled environment meant to ensure safety and survival, and Karen was now a part of its operation in a way she never expected. At first, Karen probably didn't realize the extent of what had just happened. She may have tried to twist and pull at the locked door, thinking she could force it open, or perhaps she assumed it was a glitch in the system. But her attempts were in vain. The system was built to prevent exactly this kind of reaction. The moment the door sealed, the lockdown procedure went into effect. The more she struggled, the more the system adapted to her movements, reinforcing the locks, securing every possible point of entry, and sending real-time alerts to my phone. Her panic must have been escalating quickly. What she didn't understand was that the shelter was not just any space. It was built with an autonomy that most people, even seasoned security professionals, would overlook. The system didn't just trap her. It monitored her every move. With each step she took inside, sensors recorded her location, her pace, and even the sound of her breathing. Karen's growing anxiety and frantic movements were not just being heard. They were being processed by the system, analyzed to ensure her safety, and more importantly, to ensure she stayed inside until I decided otherwise. The air in the shelter would have begun to feel heavy for Karen. The ventilation system, once activated for general airflow, was now operating on a restricted cycle, If Karen had thought she could break the rules of the shelter's design, she would have quickly realized how wrong she was. The temperature and air quality, while still breathable, were adjusted to be just uncomfortable enough to discourage any real attempts to break out. The system's subtle but effective approach was meant to disorient and slow down anyone who didn't understand the full scope of the shelter's capabilities. Meanwhile, my own awareness of her situation was growing. With each passing second, I could hear her through the live feed, the frantic pounding on the door, the repeated attempts to manually override the system, the harsh breathing that betrayed her increasing fear. She was trapped, and the more she struggled, the deeper she fell into the trap she had unknowingly set for herself. She thought she could simply trespass, but she was learning quickly that there were layers to my security that went far beyond her expectations. The system was designed to be thorough, deliberate, and unyielding. The door wouldn't budge, unless I manually intervened, and I wasn't in any rush to do so. There was no clock ticking down, no immediate rush. Karen was trapped in an environment that was in total control of her actions, and she could do nothing but wait for me to make the next move. But it wasn't just the physical entrapment that would start to wear on her, it was the psychological aspect. With no clear escape and no way of knowing how long she would remain there, the isolation would start to eat at her. She wasn't dealing with a mere storm shelter. She was inside a high-tech, fortified environment that could handle more than just severe weather. It was designed for crisis situations, and in this case, the crisis was her own making. As her movements grew more desperate, the system responded accordingly, adjusting the conditions inside to ensure her stay was as unpleasant as possible without compromising safety. Karen had no idea how long she would be inside or if I would let her out. The realization that she wasn't in control, that she had underestimated the scope of my security, would soon begin to dawn on her in full force. The longer she stayed in the shelter, the more I saw how her fear began to rise. This wasn't the confrontation she had been expecting. What she had imagined would be a quick trespass, a minor breach of rules that could be dismissed with a warning, was quickly turning into something far more intense. Her every movement was trapped in real-time surveillance, her actions analyzed, her frustration mounting. The shelter wasn't just a place of refuge. It was a test of her patience and willpower, and Karen was failing miserably. As the minutes ticked by, Karen's sense of control began to slip away. At first, she likely believed she could outsmart the system. Perhaps she thought that her knowledge of basic locks and simple security measures would be enough to bypass the sophisticated technology that had been designed specifically to thwart intruders like her. But with every passing second, the realization slowly dawned on her. It wasn't me she had to worry about. It was the system. And this system was not designed to be easily defeated. The technology I had put in place wasn't just for show. It was a carefully thought-out network of automated systems meant to protect not just my property, but my family's safety. What Karen had failed to understand was that the shelter wasn't a typical building that could be manipulated with brute force or clever tricks. She didn't just have to contend with a simple lock and key. The shelter's security was part of a larger integrated system that ran silently and efficiently, with an automated response to everything that occurred inside and outside of it. This was no ordinary structure. This was a fortress, complete with motion sensors, automated locking mechanisms, and surveillance cameras, all designed to track and monitor. The first sign of Karen's growing realization came when her frantic attempts to break open the door or disable the sensors only led to more confusion and frustration. The door was locked, and she could feel it. Each time she pulled or twisted, the door remained steadfast, never budging an inch. She would have been able to hear the soft click of the locking mechanisms as they engaged deeper, ensuring that any physical attempts at escape would be futile. It didn't matter how hard she tried. She was trapped. Soon after, she likely began to panic. The air in the shelter was designed to be breathable but controlled. ensuring that anyone trapped inside wouldn't suffocate, but would be forced to endure the growing discomfort. The ventilation system wasn't working to her advantage. It was working to prevent her from having the energy to keep struggling for too long. In combination with the lighting system, which adjusted in subtle ways to increase disorientation, Karen would have started to feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her. By now, she would have realized something even more unsettling. There was no emergency button to push, no override code she could find, and no physical method to reset the system. This wasn't a basic security measure that could be disabled with a few simple tricks. The lockdown was irreversible without the proper credentials, and she didn't have those. This was not the situation she was used to. She wasn't dealing with a few weak HOA rules that could be easily bent. She had stepped into a system where even the smallest of movements were recorded and analyzed. Every action, every second was being monitored, and she could do nothing to stop it. While Karen struggled with the reality of being locked inside the shelter, I had the luxury of watching it all unfold from the comfort of my home. With my phone in hand, I was able to see exactly what was happening in real time through the security cameras. Each frame of video was sent directly to me as she moved through the space, her every movement captured in perfect clarity. It was as if she were performing for an audience, unaware that every frustrated sigh, every failed attempt to escape was being stored for later. The cameras had also caught the moments when she paused, trying to regain her composure, likely trying to plan her next move, but there was nothing left to plan. She had already made her fatal mistake. She thought she could trespass and simply walk away with no consequences. She had underestimated me, but more importantly, she had underestimated the system I had put in place. The shelter was not just a building. It was a trap, and it had worked exactly as it was designed to. The growing sense of realization would have hit her hardest when she realized that her attempts to blame me for trapping her wouldn't work. She likely believed she could call the authorities or make some kind of noise that would force me into action. After all, it was easy to assume that the situation was entirely my fault, that I had intentionally locked her in for no reason. But there was one thing she hadn't anticipated: proof. The cameras had recorded everything. The moment she stepped foot inside the shelter, the system had activated, and the footage was now irrefutable. She wouldn't be able to make any excuses for herself. It wasn't me that trapped her. It was the very system that I had designed to protect my property and family. The cameras didn't lie, and her every move was being logged, time-stamped, and stored for future reference. Even if she tried to claim that I had trapped her intentionally, the video evidence would tell a very different story. I didn't have to say a word. The proof was already there. Karen had walked into the trap herself, and no amount of shouting, pleading, or blaming would change that fact. The more she struggled inside that shelter, the more the futility of her actions became apparent. Karen was trapped, and there was nothing she could do to get out unless I decided to release her. But by now I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The situation was too perfectly designed, and I was in full control. Karen could stay in there until I decided to let her out, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The longer she remained trapped, the more I would be able to savor the irony of the situation. The one person who had always tried to bend the rules was now completely helpless against a system designed for her exact type of behavior. It was clear to me now, Karen wasn't just locked in a storm shelter. She was locked in a lesson she would never forget. When I finally decided to release Karen from the storm shelter, it was clear she had reached a breaking point. The moment the door unlocked, she stumbled out in a frenzy, gasping for breath as if she had just come up from underwater. Her body was slick with sweat, her clothes clinging to her skin as though the shelter's controlled environment had somehow amplified her anxiety. Her eyes were wide, filled with panic and confusion, but it was too late for her to play the victim. Now, She had been fully exposed to the consequences of her actions, and there was no turning back. I stood there calmly, watching her struggle to regain composure. The control I had over the situation was complete. It wasn't just about trapping her in the shelter. It was about making her face the full weight of her actions. She had trespassed into my personal space, violated my privacy, and assumed she could break the rules without any real repercussions. The system had already done its job. It had trapped her, isolated her, and made her realize how powerless she was when up against a force she didn't understand. Now, it was my turn to ensure that the rest of the consequences followed through. As she stood there, gasping and trying to steady herself, I took a moment to let the silence settle between us. She looked like she wanted to scream, but there was no point in doing so. The damage was done, and I wasn't in any rush to let her off the hook. I wasn't interested in playing the role of the good neighbor, offering her a simple apology for a minor inconvenience. What she had done was far from that. Trespassing into my storm shelter wasn't just an innocent mistake. It was a direct violation of my rights, my privacy, and my family's safety. And Karen needed to understand the severity of that violation. I began to speak, my voice calm but firm. There was no need to yell or escalate the situation further. I didn't have to. Karen's whole world had already been flipped upside down. She thought she could simply walk away from this without consequences, but I wasn't going to let that happen. I reminded her that trespassing into my storm shelter wasn't just an HOA violation. It was a serious breach of my privacy and security. This wasn't a small issue I could brush off or forget about. Her actions had disrupted my life in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend, and now she would be forced to face the consequences. It was clear she hadn't expected this. She probably thought that because of her HOA status, she could get away with bending the rules. Maybe she assumed that her position within the neighborhood's power structure would protect her from the fallout of her actions. But she was about to learn that this time, her HOA influence wouldn't save her. The law wasn't on her side, and now neither was I. I calmly explained that I had already reported the incident to the authorities. Karen's face turned ashen at the mention of the police. I could see the realization hit her hard. She had assumed that all she needed to do was show up and demand what she wanted, but the reality was far different. The police weren't going to back her up just because of her HOA connections. This wasn't a simple neighborhood dispute. She had trespassed into my private, secure space, and that was something the authorities would take seriously. She started to stammer, trying to explain herself, but I wasn't having it. There was no justification for what she had done. Her excuses were hollow, and at this point they didn't matter. I had everything documented. The footage from the security cameras, the timestamps, the recorded motions, all of it was indisputable proof of her actions. There was no way for her to spin the story in her favor. She could plead all she wanted, but the facts were already out there. The authorities would see the footage, hear her attempts to bypass the system, and understand the full scope of what she had done. There was no escaping the truth. Karen's panic only grew as I spoke. She could feel the walls closing in, and it was clear she wasn't ready to face what was coming next. But this wasn't about my personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring that there were real consequences for her actions. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed, thinking she could do whatever she wanted just because she had some misplaced sense of entitlement. As the reality of the situation set in, Karen started to beg for mercy. She pleaded for me to reconsider, promising that she wouldn't cause any more trouble. But it was too late. The law had already been set in motion, and there was no going back. I wasn't about to make her life easy just because she had been caught red-handed. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. Karen needed to understand that her actions had consequences, and she would have to answer for them. At this point, I could see the shift in her demeanor. The confident, entitled attitude she had once carried with her had crumbled, replaced by a desperate need to escape the fallout of her own making. But the truth was simple. She had crossed a line, and now she would have to face the consequences of her choices. Her HOA power couldn't protect her here, and she would soon learn just how far-reaching the law could be when it came to protecting individual rights. I left her standing there, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear, as the reality of the situation sank in. It wasn't just about being trapped in a storm shelter. It was about understanding that some actions couldn't be undone. She had made a mistake, and now she was about to learn the hard way that there were no shortcuts when it came to accountability. If you thought this story was wild, wait until you hear what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button and join the thousands of viewers who are following the HOA stories for more shocking, jaw-dropping HOA tales. Don't miss out on the drama, the twists, and the unforgettable moments. Stay tuned for the next video, because with the HOA stories, the real drama is just getting started.